Hi there, I am the newbie, which is my nickname. Today I'm talking to you about a mix session from a band called Nerd Therapy, who are based in central New York. I go back a long time with a couple of the members of the band, and one of them I played with for many years in a band, and we've been friends for about 30 years. And so when I heard they were starting up this project that I believe originated in drum circles and then went into a more jam band kind of format, I was curious about the output of the music because uh, I'd been told that it was diverse in nature. There's some funk, there's some pop, there's some metal in air quotes because they're not really a metal outfit, but the diversity of their output had me interested in how they produced the music. And given a pandemic, it made it even more interesting because they were doing these recordings, many of them by way of virtual recording, where then the tracks would be all played live. You'll have some improvised parts. And I was wondering, as someone who's really interested in music production, now that I play music less these days, how to make a cohesive sounding mix out of the source material while also showcasing all of the players. So today we're going to be talking about a song called Tour de Force. And I like the song Tour de Force because it, to my ears at least, it has a little bit of a Depeche Mode vibe to it. And there's this really hooky chorus, and I based the entire mix around trying to showcase that chorus and also trying to figure out all the neat improvisational bits that came into the song. But before I get into the mix, I wanted to talk a little bit about some shout outs around the gear that was used. Now, I'm not advocating for any of these things one way or the other. I don't have endorsement deals. This is simply stuff over the years I've collected, and it works for my workflow, and I like the way it sounds in a mix. So, Waves has been around forever. I bought their C1 compressor years ago, really liked it, and have expanded my portfolio, I guess you can call it, of Waves products over the years, and now have a pretty complete set. Slate Digital is an American company I really like. I got a Black Friday deal on their products probably 7, 8 years ago, and I've been using them ever since. And they're really the foundation of everything that takes place in terms of the processing that takes place in this mix. And I'll call out who's what as we go. I'm using PreSonus Studio One. I also use Logic Pro 10, and I use Cakewalk as well. I don't have a horse in that race. And, if you have comments about it, please drop them in the comment section. I'm always all ears to evaluate something new, or if I miss something with this product, please weigh in. iLok is used by the Slate products. It's not my favorite. I guess it's a necessary evil to preserve intellectual property, but yes, I have an iLok plugged into my computer. And then JamHub was used by the band. And I'm fascinated with this. I've never used it, but I just wanted to call it out in case you were interested and wanted to take another look at it. So, how did I mix this song? In total, between getting the raw audio files from one of the band members, where I believe it was 8 total files, and each were left right, i.e., a stereo pair, uh, I imported them into Studio One from there. But back when I first started mixing, and this dates back to the days of 2 tracks, and like I had a Yamaha 4 track for a while, I had a Fostex reel to reel 8 track for a while. I used to mix things simply by ear. I wouldn't look at meters. I didn't really have that much off-board gear, and uh, it was fine for a while. But obviously, when you're dealing with bigger sessions, you want a specific sound in the mixes. You want to do more with what you're given, and you want it to sound, and I'm not trying to be bold when I say this, you want it to sound quote unquote radio ready as you can. I want to have it sound like something I didn't mix in a room in my house. I want to have it sound like someone who knows what they're doing. And only you can be the judge of that, of course. So I follow this basic technique in mixing every song, regardless of the genre and regardless of the instrumentation that I've been given. The first part is gain, staging, and phase. I'll explain what that is, even though we're going to be looking at a mix that is pretty much complete at this point, but I'll explain what the concepts are, and there's plenty of stuff around this on YouTube that you can look at these concepts if you want to learn more about them. Second of all, I do a level set, and I set a panning in the mix. So I don't add any effects. I don't do anything crazy until I get the levels set. and then I get things panned and I fit them in the images, and I listen back to it, and I make sure everything has got the right corresponding levels and that the overall level of the song is set, and I'll explain why I do that. Third, I do something called top-down mixing, where I create a mix bus where I send a certain chain of effects. And what this does for me is by mixing down in or mixing into these effects, it means I don't mix a song and then add something as far as an effects chain into a mix bus. I found actually it was counterproductive to add things after I've done a mix, because then I found I spend all my time readjusting the mix, and oftentimes I just start over. So top-down mixing, someone had told me about, say, 4 or 5 years ago, and I've used that technique ever since. Next is busing. And so busing gave me a way to partition all of the work, where you'll see a drum bus and an organ bus or a keys bus or whatever as we go. And that allowed me to treat various instruments or groups of instruments individually. And I found that it gives me a total flexibility when I mix, and I can also treat each one with different chains of plugins that do different things. Finally, you'll see channel plugin chains, which I'll talk about why I made the choices. You'll see things like wide bus, etc. And then finalizing the mix. This really comes down to the level I wanted to achieve in the mix should make sense. The level of the mix should be cohesive throughout the mix, where you don't hear these abnormal peaks and so on and so forth. So that is our starting point or that's what we're going to cover today in Mixing Tour de Force. So let's get into the tune. So I want to start by playing the song for you. The big thing is that this is what I'm considering to be a mostly completed mix. What you see here is you see this main fader. You don't see any inserts. And if we go down here, there's a mix bus with some plugins inserted into it. And I'll get into that as we talk about top-down mixings. But let's hear the song for a moment or two, and I'll explain some other things I did, and I'll explain how I started. So let's get into it. Okay, so that was the basic idea of the song and the way the dynamics sound in a mostly final mix. I want to call one thing out here. So the chorus is the most dynamic part of the song. As I mentioned, as I explained my workflow in mixing the song, the chorus is, I found, the most powerful part of the song, as you would anticipate it would be. And since it really stuck out to me, I mixed everything around it. So I literally mixed the chorus first as I was putting plugins into the chain, and as I was checking the levels on the mix bus I created. And I want to show you something important. Now, what you see here on this main right now, there are no levels going through it, but take a look at the levels. They're going to be somewhere between, say, -6 and, say, -7.5. And I'll explain why those were the levels I went for, even in the earliest phase of this mix, before I had added any effects, before I had panned anything, before I had set all the levels for each channel and each bus. So take a look at the levels and take a look at the consistency. Let me play through for another minute or so. Okay, so in you watching those levels, you can tell they were pretty consistent. There was some fluctuation, but I wanted to let the song breathe a bit. The reason I left it at those levels, and you can verify what these levels mean by taking a look online as to, what's DBFS, what's LUFS, etc., is because I I mix as a mix, and I anticipate that someone is going to have a song be mastered where mid and side are taken into the mastering configuration, i.e. center channel and left and right, if you will. Loudness is taken into consideration. Any additional tape warmth or EQ or whatever is a completely separate process in my mind. So I don't mix songs hot. I'm giving the mastering engineer, or even if the band themselves wants to master a song, I'm giving them some headroom so that they can then get things to the appropriate level to put on something like a SoundCloud or a YouTube or wherever, where if songs are too hot, mix-wise or level-wise or mastering-wise, they're going to be dithered down to a max volume. So I'm giving someone the space to get the levels the way they want in a mastering process and allowing the music to sound like it's supposed to, rather than being squashed by a service that's going to insist that there's a certain standard for levels, which is great because we went through loudness wars a few years ago. So anyway, you'll see a bunch of tracks here. There's a reference track, and I'll explain that in a second. But then there are a bunch of drums. You'll see like a left and a right, and there's a bass. There are 3 of those. I'll explain what those are as we walk through how I processed each instrument or group of instruments. I gave these tracks names like swirl and eerie and organ because these tracks sounded like organs to me. You see there's a left and a right, and one of them is muted. I'll explain as I talk about the way I set up the channels. The others just had these random names like Take 516, track 4. I was like, I don't know what this is, but it sounds like it swirls as far as the effect on the sample goes, or the effect of the instrument goes. And I said, fine, it sounds like a swirl to me. We're going to call it swirl. It just makes it easier for my eyes to look at something like swirl, and I know this is track 4 rather than Take 516 track 4. That's just me. This sounds eerie to me, like you hear the sound in a movie right before somebody gets stabbed. I couldn't think of a better point of reference just then. So that was my take, and that's why I named it that way. Also, right after I imported the tracks, I made sure they were all aligned. You'll see a reference track here. This came from the band themselves. They said, yeah, this was our last mix of the song. To my ears, when I listened to it, I said, yeah, I'd like to base my mix on the way this sounds. So I use this as a reference because you figure 2 things. 1, this is where they were going with the mix. And 2, since I'm importing individual tracks, I didn't want there to be any problems with phase alignment because I hadn't lined any of these tracks up with how things should sit in the song. So I literally, as my first step before I set any levels at all, I played each track against the reference track to make sure it was lined up, and then I checked phase to make sure there wasn't anything funky going on. There are many ways to check phase. I'm not going to go deep with it, as I told you earlier, but just understand that if something sounds weird before you've mixed a song, it's only going to get worse when you try to mix the song. I've learned this the hard way, believe me. So after all these tracks were put in place, what I did was all the tracks out of the box are set to unity. They're set to 0, right? What I did was I made sure all the tracks were playing. I made sure the reference track was muted because at this point, because I'd already lined everything up, I only had to refer to the reference track if I was in a pinch and I had to figure something out. But otherwise, I kept this muted for the whole session. So all these tracks were unity, and they were going through this main. And so what I did was I highlighted all these tracks, and when they first come through main and everything is set to unity, this thing was clipping like crazy, as you would imagine. So since they were all highlighted, I just dragged down the fader, and that therefore, since they were all highlighted, it dragged down all the faders. And then until this got to say, I think I chose -7, -7.5. That is the idea of gain staging. You know that on a whole, the overall level of the project that you're mixing, and like I said, I set these numbers for myself when I mix anything that gives room for a mastering engineer to do their jobs. So there was no panning, there was no busing, there were no effects. It was just the unprocessed tracks going through a main bus. That's my first step in the mix. But there's a 1B to all this. Now, I had talked about comparing phase between the reference track and each individual track to make sure that there weren't collisions that would cause things to suddenly get muted or muddy or weird sounding or flangey, or you can use a term to describe phase really any way you want. And then I compared tracks against one another to do phase. Now, it's a tedious process, but it's a worthwhile process. I'm not going to cover it here. I've already done it. But like I said, tons of tutorials on YouTube and otherwise on the net around dealing with phase issues, how to correct them, what phase issues are, etc. The third step then, after I've already done my gain staging and I've already gone through and checked phase for everything, then I set the levels for all these. These levels you see on these channels were set without any plugins. It was just, okay, so when I set these levels, and you'll see there's some panning, hard left and hard right here, and I generally, and I'll show you one exception as we walk through the mix, I generally only pan to the center, to the hard left, and to the hard right, unless I really need something to stick out in a way where I'm going to do any deviation, somewhere between, say, 0% to 50% left, 0% to 50% right, where I might do like 25%, like half between center and left or half between center and right. I rarely, and this is just me, I rarely do exotic panning unless I, can't avoid it. So you'll see all these pans that I set up when I was just checking, setting levels for each channel and setting a pan. So I got a general idea of how this mix was going to sound. Now, this is where things get super interesting. My first pass through setting levels and setting up panning, that's where I started establishing this top-down model. Like I said, top-down model is you're mixing into a chain of effects and for specific reasons. And as I said, I've saved myself hours and hours of time of having to redo mixes, start over with mixes, etc., simply by following this method. You can use whatever you want in your mix bus, but let me walk through what I did. After I set the levels and I did all the panning, I then sent the output of every channel, regardless of what it was, directly into the mix bus. That was my first step. Now, this is a Slate Digital virtual mix rack, as you can see here. This is kind of my go-to for like a rock or pop song. I mean, I've made other choices, and there are tons of Slate console emulators, preamps, etc., that come as part of the bundle, or you can buy them separately, I think, or whatever. I use the virtual mix bus for this, and this emulates various console types, and you can look at what these types are. I use the 4G for a mix bus. I like the warmth it brings, and what I want to achieve generally with everything that's happening here is, let's say I'm averaging -7, just for the sake of discussion. All the level I'm putting into it, all the processing I'm putting into it, all the things I'm doing, for example, adding thickness after this whole thing's been washed through this digital domain, I want to bring some of the low end back, but I want to keep all the levels to where I want them. So I make sure that if I'm putting -7 in, I'm getting -7 out. If I'm putting -7 in, I don't want 3 out. I don't want -10 out, because otherwise I'm going to have to adjust things again. So this is, again, just me. I like to make sure for each phase of this, levels coming in equal levels going out. So at the end of the day with this virtual mix rack, I ended up with a little gain because I add a little thickness by way of this Revival plugin, and then I just did some adjustment in this trimmer that's part of the Slate All Access. Then I went to this VBC FG Red compressor. I believe this is based on a Scarlett compressor that's been used on thousands and thousands of mixes. I forget the exact model number, but that's irrelevant. I started with a preset, and obviously you can see I made some adjustments. What this is going to do is, it's a slower attack. This is somewhere like, I don't know, I'd say 40 milliseconds-ish. And by having a slow attack, I'm using auto release, which I was completely fine with. I then set the threshold against a 1.5 to 1 ratio, so that at max, I'm getting 3 dB of gain reduction. And what happens with this combination of things is that the drums really pop out, but everything gets glued together. So if there were vocals in the song, which there are not, you would find that by just adding this gentle kiss of compression, then doing 2 dB of makeup gain, because we're averaging about 2 dB of gain reduction, it has a really nice cohesiveness to what happens in the mix. Next is a Kramer tape. This one came from Waves, actually. This is one of my favorite plugins. Slate has their own virtual tape machines as well. I use both. I use both the Slate, and I listen to that. And even though I liked it quite a lot for this song, I wanted to go with this Kramer tape. It's really neat. There are tons of presets. I'm using one out of the box, and I just adjusted the input or record and playback or input and output, whatever you want to call them, to ensure that what signal was coming in is the signal I'm sending out. But otherwise, I use the preset as is. And then I added this gate here. Now, there's this belief with gates that you got to hammer the gate really hard. As we listen through the mix, I'm actually very gentle with the gating, because what happens is if the gate is too aggressive, you'll find that instruments literally drop out of the mix because they can't pass through the gate. And that's silly, because suddenly all the hard work you did in making a mix is for nothing. So all the gate does is says is gentle enough where there's quiet in the song. It shuts out any noise, and it gives us also some nice tape noise that come from this Kramer tape plugin towards the end of the song, where it just finishes playing and gradually shuts the gate, and that's it. So that is our starting steps. Everything went through this mix bus here. So after we've done the gain stage and phase, we've done setting up our top down, we've set up our levels, we've set up our padding, that's where I started to go and work on buses. So I decided to do something with drums. As you can tell, one of the drum tracks is muted and it never gets unmuted. I know this is a left-right pair, but there's a way I perceive drums in a mix, and there's a way I like to work with drums in general. The way I like to do it is I perceive drums as being 4 or 5 separate parts, but for kick drum and snare drum, they're going to be dead center in a mix, almost always, or at least for this application, being a kind of poppy song. So I muted this one. I said, fine, we're going to send down the center into a drums bus. I haven't processed this channel. You can tell at all. There are no inserts here. And so at this drum bus itself, you'll see there are a chain of things. First, I started with the Kramer tape again. For this mix, it worked for me. I really like it in general, but I didn't end up using the Slate virtual tape machines in this one at all. Made sure our record and playbook back level were corresponding to the level of the drums. I did a virtual mix rack here next. What you see is drum bus rather than drum bass, drum bus tight and punchy. And I started with a preset. As you can tell, I've made some changes to it. Because we were already dealing with a track that was not only a full set of drums in a track, essentially a stereo pair, but these were also V drums. And I was trying to capture some of the attack of the V drums with the understanding that I just want to bring life to them. But at the end of the day, if you listen closely enough, God bless Roland, some of the best gear I've ever used in my life, everything always sounds like a Roland to me. So I didn't want to change the Roland into anything else. All I wanted to do, as you can tell, around 50 hertz here, I cranked it. There's like 4 dB of gain because I wanted to hear some boom coming out of that kick drum in the mix, because I found that the processed instruments didn't have that. I did a cut around 400 hertz and with kind of a narrow curve. And because the way I did this was I cranked this volume up all the way, I listened to it. And I found that as I kind of swept around in here, there were just kind of like this muddiness and this harmonic bonk, I call it. It just sounds really gross and weird. And plus we need to have some space for the bass. So I found this kind of obnoxious frequency wise. I cut it out at about like a dB and a half and with a very narrow curve. So it is not too aggressive in squashing the other drums. Then I tried to sweep around a little bit and figure out where the beater was, hitting the drum head as far as the kick drum goes. And I found it around 4K, which is typically where you will. This is getting a treatment of 2+ dB, and it's a wider curve because, there's a wider frequency band when the beater hits the kick drum head. And then I went into like these higher frequencies where you'll get some more of the kick drum. Potentially you're getting some other artifacts from toms and things like that maybe capture a part of the snare, and this just gets 1 dB. Here you see there's a drum bus tightener. This is an FG401 compressor. This is just getting a kiss somewhere between 3 and 5 dB of gain reduction, and then actually it's even less. I believe it's closer to 1 or 2 now that I think about it. And then I do 1 dB of makeup gain. Here I do revival. I bring some shimmer in because I really want to bring up that high end of the hi-hats and a little bit of cymbals, but a lot of those things, I'm just trying to bring life to it. And I'm adding more thickness here because we've just compressed. So compressor's doing its job, doing a great job, but we want to do something more with the dynamics because as I promised, I wanted to bring them out. Then there's this thing called the FG Bomber. I love this plugin. It's part of the Slate stuff like all this is here. My goal is to literally get this needle to sit on 0 as much as possible, and it does something with snare drums and to a point with kick drums where I just find it just provides a neat slap in the mix. And since I'm trying to bring life to V drums, I found this was a perfect move right here. And then again, volume in, volume out, I just figured out where the reduction was on the trimmer, and there's, that's the move. Now, I put limiters on bass and drums, and the reason for this is there are fluctuations in playing. Now, I'm not super aggressive with what my limiter is doing, but my target for drums, and this is, again, just the way I like to hear them in a mix for the song like this and what I've just learned over time, I want them to peak around -12-ish and be consistently there without hammering them with like a lot of compression and putting too much volume. This is just to make them even in the mix. So let's listen to a before after of these drums. And yeah, I think the drums are going to start right away. So that's cool. All right, we're going to solo this drum bus. We're going to get rid of these inserts. We're going to turn off the send for a second. And this is just the drums with levels. Here we go. And you can tell it's hitting a little bit below 12. That's actually what as I finalize the mix, that's kind of what it came with. And then, I just don't want it to really exceed 12. So this is pretty consistent overall. But then again, this is not processed, and that's why you're seeing this wild fluctuation of level, which we correct with the inserts. So let's bring the inserts in and do an A/B as it plays. So I'll start without and then bring it in, then you'll see the button get triggered. Okay, here we go. See, hear the difference in the kick and the snare, just how the snap happens versus without. See how they kind of sound lost without? So that was my processing here. Okay, so you see a send, or actually you see a couple sends here. What do we do? Well, what we did was I decided to do a couple things with the drums because as I listened back to this, I liked what happened in the drum bus initially, okay? I liked that it brought some snap to the drums. The snare really became pronounced. But I also found that the hi-hats and the cymbals and stuff were lacking, and that's to be expected. They're digital. They don't have the same resonance in a room or they're being picked up by multiple microphones, etc. So my first move was to do something called parallel compression. I've heard this called New York compression, New York style compression, all kinds of stuff. What parallel compression is doing is I'm using this Waves solid state logic bus compressor. This is one of my favorites that I ever picked up from Waves. It's super versatile, but I love it when I'm parallel processing drums. I'm hitting this guy with a ton of compression. I believe we are averaging out averaging out 14 decibels of gain reduction, but we're making that up by adding 12 or 14 back based on my average gain reduction. But by having a slow attack like this of 30 milliseconds, having a quick release of, I believe it's 30 milliseconds there, and having a high ratio, what happens with the drums is all of a sudden, in particular for kick and snare or for toms, you get this just booming, attacky thing that complements then the drum bus when you blend the two signals. Let's listen to it by itself, and then I'll show you all you're going to hear is a lot of attack, and it's going to sound squished, but that's the point. So let's give this a listen. So this is just the drum bus by itself. Now, let's hear drums parallel and what that's doing. And without, now with. And notice how this is kind of peaking out at negative 24. And that's what we want. We just want it to be blended in. We don't want to hit people over the head with this, massively compressed thing, because it just sounds off. Next, I did a drums room, and this is a send from the drum bus itself. So all I really want to accomplish here is just add some room space to the drums. So let's listen to it without, and I'll put it in. You can just tell it just lets them breathe a bit. I believe we're hitting somewhere between negative 24 and negative 35 as far as overall level, but it just brings some depth to V drums, which are super cool. But like I said, I just tried to bring in some life by way of attack and by creating some space for them. So here we go. See the difference? Cool. So you can tell the difference. I mean, it's night and day. Bring some room for the drums. It's awesome. The next thing, though, you see this drum hi-hat isolate. Now, the one thing with V-drums is, while I really love the V-drum mechanism for hi-hats and how it's really playable and it's got the pedal and the aesthetic is there, and by all accounts they sound pretty good, the one thing I did here was that I wanted to just bring some life to them. And I've used this technique with analog drums a bunch of times. You can see I rolled off up to 5K. So essentially, I'm not processing any of these lower signals with the drums. I just want to focus on anything that's related to brass on the kit. Mainly hi-hats, but you get some other stuff, maybe like a ride or maybe a cymbal or something like that. But then I go to Virtual Mix Rack itself, and I'm using the 4KE. This is a virtual channel console. Comes with the Slate stuff. These are all Slate things. There's this Hollywood preamp that I used here, and I found that by just adding some subtle saturation, it really added some bite. I mean, I guess that's the best way I can put it. Added some bite to the incoming hi-hats and other brass. Then all I do is I add this custom series equalizer at 15K, where there's this neat thing that happens with a hi-hat. I totally hammer it with volume because that's the element I want to bring out. And then I trim the volume because input equals output. But the next two things I do are, you see this E2 de-esser. I found that because I put so much emphasis on the high end, there was a little bit of sibilance going on in certain parts here. So I just toned it down slightly because I found that it wasn't sitting well with the other drums. Because don't forget, we also have cymbals and hi-hats and stuff coming out of the drum bus, and they're coming out of parallel compression. So they just needed to be, stay in your box a little bit, guys. Everything will be fine. Here's something called Dual Pan. Dual Pan is actually part of PreSonus Studio One. There are many of these. Apple has their own. Pro Tools has its own. And I talked about, how I usually don't like to pan stuff unnecessarily. This is just my ears, my brain, and the way I process sound. But here, I really liked bringing the hi-hats that I had bussed here to essentially mid-left and mid-right. And I found they really popped out then. So let's listen to this whole shebang without and then within, and it's a discernible difference. So let's get into it. Hear them really pop out here. Now without. And back in. It's very subtle, but it does something. In particular when I bring in a bass, which we're going to talk about next. Yes, without. Then bring it back in, because the bass takes up space, and I'll explain why. All right. So the next thing I worked on was the bass, and let's just talk about that. The bass was interesting here because there were a couple things. And when I sound critical of this, I'm really not. This is a stylistic thing, and the player who did the bass track has, I don't know if it's a chorus or a flanger, but there's something that adds a real wetness to the sound. And I found that when I'm mixing a bass, like if I'm playing live, I love chorus on bass. I think I love the tonality, brings a huge musicality to the bass. It takes up a lot of space. It sounds really cool. For mixing, though, I prefer a drier signal. And so in these raw tracks, what I found was that there was a lot of chorus in both of them. I was having a hard time sitting them in with the drums, and also the bass has a good driving line to it. So I said, well, how can I just add a little bit of edge to this? So I decided I copied one of the bass tracks to a third one, and we'll talk about that first. What I wanted was just to add an amp and room sound to this. So I added a cabinet, I added a head, I did a little bit of dialing just to give this some teeth, and this is, and I mixed it or blended it in with the other bass sounds. So here, let's listen to that. Actually, it's coming in here. So you get some of the chorus in there, but you also get this grind. You get this teeth from the amplifier itself. So anyway, I added a little bit of, I'm calling this distortion. I added a little preamp overdrive, and here's that. And what I did is I didn't want that preamp distortion to really consume the higher frequencies of the bass. We're already treating that well with this channel right here and this virtual bass amp and cabinet. So what I did was say, yeah, I rolled off a lot of frequencies, and you get a nice growl here. And this growl's just underneath the surface. And I found that kind of took away from some of the chorusy wash I was hearing as I was mixing the song, and I also found that it fit in better with the drums and the other instrumentation. As far as the original bass track goes, I used the fat bass. You could tell I made some changes. I rolled everything off below, I think this is 35 hertz. And the reason being is it was just taking up so much space. The kick drum wasn't punching through, and I didn't like that. Then I found a sweet spot here, and I cranked the hell out of it. I believe this is around 80 hertz. Then I left 1.6 alone. I found some neat information around 3.2, little bit of string definition, just wanted to hear it in the mix. There's nothing really major going on here with this custom series equalizer. I believe here I've rolled off everything above 4K, because as I swept around various EQs, I found that there was no usable information, which is what I would have expected from a bass. And then there was just some kind of sizzle that was unpleasant, and so I just kind of said, fine, we're not gonna try to mix with this. It was making things sound not so great. The gain reduction, I believe, is between -3 ish, and we're then adding that back. This is a rock bass, and I dialed this up just to. It was super aggressive, and I just wanted a little bit of compression on the bass because the bass was already kind of processed. So all I wanted to accomplish here was just bring out a little bit of string definition and a little slap sound, a little slappy kind of sound. Then you see one more wash through this equalizer. I found some nasty frequencies around 160. It had to be corrected. And then up here, you'll see that I found some other frequencies that I wanted to bring out a little bit. Finally, there's this 2A. Now, I love the 2A. You can use it as a limiter or as a compressor, but you figure what I did with a bass is I cranked a bunch of frequencies, I compressed them, but then as I watched the bass in the mix itself, I was like, well, this is wildly fluctuating, and I don't want to be too aggressive with, over-processing the compressor. So I just used the 2A to do some leveling, very gentle compression. At some point, we don't even see this move because, like I said, I was very, very conservative in using this because I already compressed the bass. So all I'm trying to do with this 2A is control the peaks so that they were more even. And then you see in equals out. So that's why the trimmer is here. That's the change for bass. Now, let's play them all together. Or I'll start individually again from just this just this original bass track that I processed with EQ and compression, and then I'll bring in the others, and you can tell the difference, and you can tell the difference in just setting levels a certain way. So here we go. Now let's add the distortion in. And very, very gentle on the distortion. Not very much level, just a bite. That's really cool. And now the amp. Okay, so that's the way I want it to sound. Now, one thing I wanted to tell you about the way I mix, I'm showing you separately how things sound. When I mix a song, I mix with everything because I've already set up levels. I've already set up panning. I mix everything in context because let's say you EQ a kick drum or you EQ a bass and on its own it sounds great, but when you play it in the mix, it sounds terrible. You've done yourself a disservice. So I did everything in context. I'm just showing you what I did individually to see how things, pop out on their own and pop out once they're processed. So this is I added some more inserts to the bass bus. The bass bus, as you can see here, I don't mix bass and stereo unless I really have to. So this is a mono bus where you see drums and all this are stereo, and I was fine with that. It sounded weird to me in stereo. There was already some kind of chorusy stuff going on the bass. So I said, yeah, this is going to be mono. I'm going to put it dead center anyway. There's no sense in doing anything fancy. So here, in equals out with the tape. I'm using a DI bass. Hello, it's not a fish. I'm using a DI bass fattener, and because it was technically, I guess, a DI when it came through the audio interface for the jamming stuff. Then I said, fine. This is the best of the presets, and I did some minor adjustments to it. So in equals out. Virtual mix rack, I went with a metal bass because the way I processed those 3 tracks together, it's very gentle compression, but I just wanted a little more teeth to it, or kind of shape around those teeth. Finally, I'm using this Q4. It's an equalizer. I'm boosting at 80 hertz. I just put a little level there. And then again, at 4K, I'm just saying, anything above 4K, ignore it. So that's the essence of it. And actually everything under 80 hertz, ignore that as well. And so it worked out. And then I use a limiter on bass. It doesn't do anything aggressive. It's just like that last round of making sure we stay in this realm of I think in the mix, I ended up with going -14 because against the drums, it sat really well from there. So in any case, this is session 1 for this. In the next session, I'm going to cover the rest of the instruments and how I fit them in. The mix itself, like I said, took me 6 hours, maybe 8 in total, because I did a couple of adjustments as I let my ears rest a bit. One other thing I'll say is that when I mix the song, there's a tendency when music is intense, whether it be metal or rock or a song like this that's poppy and catchy, you enjoy the song, you listen to it loud. Well, I do when I'm listening to it as a listener. When I mix, I actually mix as quiet as possible. I mix on the lowest volume. And what that allows me to do is 2 things. 1, my ears don't get tired, and I'm able to work longer. And 2, if a mix sounds good when it's quiet and you've done the right moves when you're doing your processing in channels and in buses, it's going to sound good when it's loud as well. So what we're doing here is we're following our eyes with the meters. We're trusting our eyes. We're trusting the meters. Input equals output. And then we're trusting our ears. So when we see things that are relative volumes, our ears will say, yeah, I mean, it looks good to me and it sounds good because everything is sitting. And you'll know when it's sitting because it suddenly makes sense. And your mix bus here doesn't have wild fluctuations and levels. And you go from one portion of the song to another and it sounds totally cohesive. So this is the end of session 1. And the next session, I'm going to cover the rest of these tracks right here, what they're doing, and decisions I made around automation. You see these automation lanes here, and I want to talk about why they're there and some musical decisions I had to make when mixing the song. Thanks for watching part 1.